Serious, who is the scariest person you've ever met? I had a classmate in second grade who had no emotions. His name was Carl. He was like an empty vessel. One day for show and tell he brought in a cat's skull and told the class it was his family's cat Peter. It smelled terrible and the teacher flipped out and sent him to the office. Didn't see him for a few days. When he returned he spent all day every day staring the teacher down. One day he took his pen up to the desk and stabbed her in the leg. He was immediately expelled. Never thought I'd see him again. Senior year in high school we get a new kid. It's Carl. Back. He didn't hang out with anyone. Stayed by himself during lunch. This girl Patty that I was talking to, trying to bang, kept getting followed home by him every day and would wait outside her house, across the street, for hours, studying and taking pictures of her house. I started walking her home every day and he would always be there, so one day I asked what his problem was. He just said you and walked away. That night he broke into Patty's house but like a shithead didn't think to check if anyone was home, so Patty's dad stopped him almost immediately and called the cops. They found a ton of weird drugs and weapons on him, and like surgical equipment in his backpack. Never saw him again. When I was first sent to prison in 2006 I was locked up with Mitchell Overhand, we just called him Spike though. Back in 1988, when he was 16, he shot both his parents. He didn't think his mom was dying fast enough so he bashed her head in with a hammer. Then buried them in the backyard and threw a party. Scariest thing about Spike was how intelligent he was. When you talked to him he was always cool and collected, very mindful of everything he said and did. Anytime we talked though all I could think about was the monstrous things he was capable of. I did not really meet him but was hiking one day and a guy stepped out of the woods as I approached. I did the normal hiker hello and he just stared at me and said nothing and started inching further out of the woods onto the trail blocking the path as I approached. A friend's dog I was hiking with came bounding out of the woods and the guy disappeared into the woods as soon as he saw it. Dog got some tasty treats that night. I was playing in our front gated yard when I was just a few years old with my mom in our lab. My mom stepped inside to grab the phone or something else trivial, and while she was inside she heard a commotion. She came outside to see our dog attacking some guy that had come inside our fenced-in yard. She suspects he was trying to kidnap me and that our dog saved my life. She called the police but she never saw the guy again. And never left me unattended for any amount of time in the yard after that. My mom has a friend who wanted a Shih Tzu but somehow got talked into getting a German Shepherd. She started training it and was amazed at how well it was going so she went ahead and did the advanced training courses with simple hand gestures to signal the dog and such. One day someone was banging on the back door to her house. She opened the door with the chain still locked and some big guy tried to force his way in while verbally threatening her. The dog sat there next to her waiting for any signal to move in and tear the guy a new asshole. As soon as the dude looked down and saw the dog he decided he was at the wrong house and left quick. I had a neighbor. Some of you read about him in a previous post. He was abused physically, mentally, and, possibly, sexually by his parents. He was an absolute nightmare to live around. He had absolutely no sense of right and wrong, and loved to hurt people, an honest-to-God sadist. Not that he didn't come by it honestly. He was absolutely tormented. That being said, you might call the better part of our friendship normal. We did normal shit. Watched movies, played football, played Sega Genesis. But sometimes you just rub him the wrong way and he'd snap. I told him his mom was really loud when she yelled one time, and he walked away like he was mad. I didn't think much of it. I was walking back inside and then all of a sudden I'm on the ground bleeding all over the place. He threw a rather large rock at my head and busted it open, basically. I had to go to the hospital for stitches. I told my mom that it was an accident. He got weirder. He liked to talk me and his sister into doing weird sexual things while he'd just watch, and if I tried to stop he'd tell me to keep going or threaten to beat me up. Keep in mind we were around 9 to 10. Guy shot birds, squirrels, etc., with his BB gun, would keep the carcasses on his back porch, and I'm pretty sure messed around with them. The strangest thing I ever saw him do, I was on my porch with him, and he asked if I wanted to see something cool. I said sure. We walked across the street to a neighbor's house, and he jumped on the car hood and just started kicking in the windshield. It wouldn't bust, so he went to the neighbor's back porch and found a garden hoe and just destroyed this guy's car. The guy wasn't home, but a ton of people saw him do it. I jetted the moment he came back with a garden hoe. The cops came to his house. I guess the guy pressed charges. I think he was around 12 at the time. He had to go through all kinds of legal shit for it. But they made him take the ride downtown and everything. And I remember so clearly looking out my window and seeing him going from his porch to the back of the cop car, just screaming his head off, "My name is Drew and my life sucks. My name is Drew and my life sucks," just screaming it over and over. Even in the cop car he was screaming as they rolled down the street. The last time I saw him was at a party, senior year. He was beyond wasted, and he was a few years out of high school. As stated in the last post about him, he committed suicide a few years ago. Very sad kid, but very scary as well. The person I'm living with, I work with her, and when I was about to be homeless she said I could rent out her spare bedroom. The first week I'm there she decides to tell me about how she is fascinated with serial killers, and that she studied them heavily in college. I'm 21. She is 32. I didn't know what to say, so I just said sounds interesting. Then 2 months into me living here, me and her were both shit-faced drunk, and she told me she's always wanted to kill someone. She added that she daydreams about it on the regular. When she told me that, I told her that I never want to piss her off. She laughed and said I wouldn't tell you this shit if I didn't trust you completely. The next day I asked her if she remembered what we talked about and she said the night was a complete blank for her. Let's just say I'm in a weird place in my life at the moment. The scariest person is someone who I don't even know. While I was back in college I had the opportunity to fly out to Kansas City to see a friend for a weekend. We hadn't seen each other in a while and I really needed a break, so I obliged the invitation. I arrived at around 9 p.m. I knew nothing about the city and he didn't have a car or cell phone because of how close his apartment was to campus. He walked to pick me up from the bus station where I got off from the airport. We went back to his apartment. We started the night off talking and drinking. It was a blast. The time went on and it quickly became 3 a.m. We noticed the time just as there came a loud knock on the door. Did someone just knock on the door with a piece of metal? I asked my friend. I think so, but let me go check. Suddenly and roaring loud we hear from the door a man calling in a deep and guttural voice, "Candy. Free candy." He continued to knock. "Open the door and come out for some free candy." My friend approached the peephole quietly and peered through. He turned around with color slowly draining from his face. He mouthed me the words, "We're going to die." He slithered to the floor and wormed his way back to where I was squatting behind the couch. Together we made our way to the back of the apartment and hid in a closet. The knocking continued. I asked him what he had seen. He must be at least 6.5 feet tall. He is black, ripped, and completely naked except for a do-rag, and has a double-barreled shotgun. His reply carried the emotions of being half amazed and shocked at what he was saying. We shat bricks while waiting for the door to come down in splinters. The knocking continued to get louder and louder. We could feel the pounding from the door and the floor where we were hiding. There was no phone to call for help, no car to run to out of the window. We were on the 4th floor with no access to the stairwell. There was nowhere for us to go. After about 15 or so minutes the knocking stopped. We no longer heard anyone yelling and offering free candy. We waited for another half hour or so before coming out and looking back into the hallway. He was gone. The next morning I went out and rented a car. My friend went and bought a cell phone. We made a police report but they never followed up on it. Scary shit. This guy I was in the army with was a killing machine. He could sprint up a mountain if there was a chance of murdering someone at the top. He even bashed someone's head in with his rifle. It was strange to see him holding his newborn baby after the deployment. I had a psychotic boyfriend for nearly 3 years. He once mentioned having revenge killed a friend's ex's cat. He once told me he'd like to burn down my house with my family in it so I'd spend more time with him. He once went for a gun. He claimed it was airsoft, under his seat when he accidentally stole a parking place at the mall in case the other driver tried to start something. He described in detail how he would go about killing an ex-boyfriend of mine that I was still friends with. After I tried breaking up with him he'd take pictures of himself sitting in his car outside my house. A few years after we broke up, I saw his car in the grocery store parking lot and nearly had a panic attack. But I pulled my shit together and went in anyway. While in the produce section I recognized him walking toward the exit. I hid behind the potatoes until he was gone. Sophomore year in high school I was over at my English classmate's house for a group project. I knew her parents had some issues in the past, notably her father who was unstable. Anyway, When it comes time for us to leave, I forgot my book inside her house, so I ran back inside to get it. It was on the coffee table in front of her dad, who had this blank, glazed look on his face. It was creepy, so I grabbed the book and went back out to the car. A few weeks later, her dad ended up killing her mom and himself. I used to work in retail, and our store had the creepiest/scariest visitor. He was this old man who was in his 80s and needed to rely on a walker to get around. This guy's nickname was Alien because he had a license plate hanging from his walker that said, "Alien." One night right before we're about to close, an employee of mine asks him about his license plate. He went on to tell us how he feels like an alien because he gets criticized for torturing the neighborhood cats. Without even asking, he went into detail of how he traps them in the hood of his truck and leaves the truck running and then skins them. We immediately asked him to leave and banned him from the store for also asking our female employees if they'd like to hang out when he's on Viagra. Needless to say, whenever my former employees see him in the mall, they avoid all eye contact and call security. He's a freaky dude. I was doing research in the rainforest of Madagascar, on top of a mountain, living in tents with a group of absolutely insane scientists and students, who happened to be some of my best friends. I was studying insects, but we had primatologists, herpetologists, botanists, cultural anthropologists, and loads of other specialists there as well, not to mention about a dozen Malagasy technicians and guides. The site was so remote it was about 20 kilometers from the nearest paved road, and took us about 12 hours on foot to reach it, due to the mountainous terrain. I remember one day in camp a pair of guys showed up we'd never met before. They were muscular as hell, not too uncommon for Malagasy farmers, and wore faded basketball jerseys. They wore Stetsons, which I thought was odd. Oh, and they also carried huge swords. Naturally, we were all a bit taken aback, since we had no way of defending ourselves, and we'd been in the country for months with no incidents of violence or intimidation. Normally, when a Malagasy person meets you, they shake your hand, they smile, and they say salama. Not following that ritual, particularly in the countryside, is tantamount to insult. They walked right into camp with no smiles, no handshakes, and complete silence. They sat at our table and stared at my research leader and started talking with no build-up at all. We had one of our technicians translate for us. Our Malagasy was pretty weak. These guys called themselves Jama, Black Magic Guardians, and claimed that they had black magic powers. Apparently, they were crime fighters, protecting the local villages in the valley from bandits. They claimed that they could transport themselves anywhere within 2 minutes, and that they were impervious to bullets. The first Jama then said that if we didn't pay him 600,000 Ariari, about $300, a tremendous sum of money for that region, we would be attacked by bandits, and they would not save us. We all figured it was a shakedown, meant to prey on locals who believed in regional religious practices, which included a belief in black magic. Or more practically, people who feared that the Jama and the bandits were in league together, collecting protection money from poor farmers. Our research leader knew he couldn't afford that money, so he instead offered them infinite free hot meals, which he could write off on his grants, and amazingly, they accepted, provided we give them some headlamps and a pair of rain boots each. They showed up a few days later, proudly wearing their gifts, and all smiles. They ate a shitload of rice, gave us a bottle of moonshine from the leader of their village, and went on their way. Weird guys. Edit. Eventually I left camp and came back to the US, but my research leader emailed me out of the blue one day to tell me that the Jama actually caught a bandit trying to steal from the market 2 or 3 villages over. They beat him up, cuffed him with rope, and dragged him to the nearest town. Shit was insane. A friend of mine had a business meeting with Charles Taylor, the Liberian warlord. They never reached the real estate agreement they met for. In his words, "You don't know fear until you feel as powerless and helpless as he makes you feel." I didn't realize how scary this guy was until afterward. I was at a concert and this guy was standing nearby. I was a bit drunk and turned to talk to a friend and bumped this guy's backpack. He glowered at me menacingly, so put my hand up and said something hilarious like, "Sorry bud, backpack attacked me." Fast forward a bit and a couple drinks and someone bumps me into the guy again while dancing/moving around during the music. He turns around and glowers again. I said, "Hey man, you're in the front row at a rock show wearing a backpack, people are going to bump you. Gonna have to deal with it." He looked me right in the eye, slapped my shoulder and did a little friendly shake thing, then said, "Don't sweat it, man." So I say, "Cool, cheers bro," fairly sarcastically. He turns around, but a guy that was with him turns kind of pale and looks at me for a minute before turning around too. 20 minutes later my friend who was playing comes over to me and says, I should stay away from that guy because he's one of the biggest cocaine and heroin dealers in the area and he's not averse to or inexperienced in extreme violence and murder. He said, "I thought he was going to stab you when he turned around." I steered clear, but I kind of brushed it off as I don't live in an extremely scary area, so the biggest fish in S small pond is still a small fish. That all changed when I looked up his extensive and brutal criminal record online, and a few news stories that named him as an arrested party. I was quite glad to have only the holes I was born with and to be alive. I saw him at another concert a few weeks later and he gave me the nod. I nodded back and drank very little that night. Reading everyone else's stories here puts my scariest person into a not so scary after all category, but whatever. There was a creepy guy who sat behind me in pre-cal junior year of high school. At the end of the year he handed me a Ziploc baggie that contained various strands of my hair that had fallen out, or maybe he plucked, I don't know anymore. There were also strands of his own hair in the bag. He then told me, "Now that our hairs are united, maybe we can be too." I avoided him for the remainder of high school. I went to school with two kids that killed my sister's best friend. They were in ROTC with my sister's best friend and decided to go mudding in one of their trucks after a party. Well, she gets out to check the ground to see if it's a good spot and they shoot her in the back of the head. They dug a shallow grave in the mud, went to eat at IHOP, then came back and covered her body. They were caught trying to cross the Canadian border. During the trial, when asked the reason for why they killed her, the guy that pulled the trigger said simply morbid curiosity. I was in the psych ward and they brought in a new patient in restraints and locked us all in one of the rooms in the unit. We could get out, but no one could get in without a key. One of the other patients sneaked a look at his file, and he was a violent schizophrenic there because he was threatening to murder people. Just a note I feel like I have to make, he was definitely in the minority as a violent schizophrenic. Most people with schizophrenia I met were great people, and even most of the ones there for homicidal ideation were very upset by those thoughts and didn't want to act on them. We heard lots of yelling and banging, and at one point when we were watching from the windows of a side room, he ran into the main room followed by a bunch of staff and started throwing around all the tables. He actually calmed down to the point where they let him walk around the room, and while I was just as terrified as the rest of the patients at first, once I saw him the fear vanished. He was a large, muscular middle-aged man, but he was also nearly crying because he thought there were bugs crawling all over him and he couldn't get them off. He actually seemed very scared. He was only there a few days before they decided that having him there wasn't worth the risk and inconvenience it posed to the other patients. Every time he would freak out again, we would have to go sit in one of the locked rooms for a while. But in between his violent episodes he would talk to me and dance to 80s music. He liked the other patients, it was the staff he had problems with, and he even taught me how to play blackjack one evening. Once he accidentally walked in on me in the bathroom. No locks on the bathroom doors, and he was so embarrassed I thought he was going to cry, and he apologized to me over and over. At first that was the most scared I've ever been of a person, but he kind of made me see the violently mentally ill in a different light. It would be really tough to have a family member with that kind of problem. He definitely didn't need to be out in public with his violent tendencies, but I don't think he was a bad person either, just very sick. My father. I've never met someone so filled with rage and raw power. One time he was about to deck this short Mexican for being an asshat, and it took 4 guys just to hold him back. When he gets mad, he gets pissed, his voice shakes the window panes, and he has on more than one occasion busted up a door. But when you talk to him, he's charismatic and intelligent. Most people haven't seen him irate, but I have. It's terrifying. When I was little, I thought he was scarier than the Hulk. I still believe he's more terrifying than the Hulk ever will be. It was a guy who I fitted hearing aids up with. He would constantly tell me about the voices and sounds that he hears in his head, but that it was okay, because he was speaking to a psychiatrist about it. It was just the way he kept looking at me with those eyes saying they're back again. He did that several times throughout the appointment, but the worst has to be when he followed that up by saying, "Want to say hello to them?" It really scared the shit out of me, and I flagged his patient profile for others to just be aware of him. I was walking a bike trail with my dog and it got dark. It's next to a river and heavily wooded. I am walking back to my car, and at this point it's completely dark and hard to see, which I am fine with. I like the woods at night. However, as I am walking, I notice that a dude steps out of the trees next to me just as I'm passing and starts walking behind me with his hood up. He just appeared when I walked by, like he was waiting for me to pass so he could come out and just walk behind me back to my car. I had my dog with me at the time, who was not happy with this unknown entity behind me, so he kept turning around barking at the guy. I was trying not to have an encounter, so I kept pulling my dog's leash. I then realized, I am not going to be scared, and felt good about defending myself if I had to. At one point the guy just stops dead in his tracks behind me. I turn around, he just stopped walking in the middle of the trail. He was still standing there even when I got far enough down the trail that when looking back he was just a speck. The creepiest thing was seeing him from a distance just stand in the middle of the trail. One summer I worked at a camp which was located in a pretty isolated area. One of the people who worked at the camp, I think in maintenance, was a kind of loner type who I guess at some point in the summer developed an interest in me. I was about 19 and he had to have been at least 40. I thought he was harmless at first, and would kind of hang around me a bit, try to chat me up, etc. I figured it was normal co-worker stuff until one night he invited me to have a drink with him. Another older guy I worked with pulled me aside and warned me to not let myself be alone with the maintenance guy. I figured he meant that the maintenance guy was planning on putting moves on me. I cannot tell you how clueless I was at that age, and was too embarrassed to ask for details, so I just decided to take his advice and keep my distance. I wasn't rude, but I just didn't stop and chat with him as I had before. Soon after, the maintenance guy came by my cabin late one night. I was sitting, in the dark outside of my cabin, just enjoying the evening when I see him come out of the woods. He couldn't see me in the dark, but my cabin's porch light was on, so I could see him, and I watched him slowly and silently circle all around my cabin, peering into all the knotholes/spaces between the boards and around the edges of the window coverings. It was bizarre, for obvious reasons, but also because he had always been really friendly and lighthearted around me. But that night I saw him in a different light. He looked dead serious, trying to make no noise, and had this intense look on his face that gave me the shivers. It did not look like it was the first time he had done that. I said something like, "Hey there, buddy, are you looking for me?" He jumped, and instantly he dropped the creepy face and turned back into the nice and friendly version of him I'd seen all summer. He told me he had been following a deer he thought he had seen in the woods and quickly left. I just remember being creeped out because I felt like I had caught the real him, what he was like when he thought no one was looking, and it did not look nice. After that, I moved to a cabin closer to other people and stayed well the hell away from that guy. I found out years later that not long after that incident he stabbed a girl to death in those woods, so I think he was pretty scary. A couple months after my mother passed away, I was put into a teen psych ward because I was suicidal. Within about 12 hours of being committed, I realized my life wasn't so bad and I needed to buck up. However, I was in there with some severely psychologically disturbed teenagers. That was scary just in general, especially when you have to be locked in your room at night because of the danger. One evening, I am sitting in the dining room with a girl who I thought was nice. I knew she was schizophrenic and had both auditory and visual hallucinations but seemed relatively normal. We were chatting and suddenly her eyes went black. She had blue eyes. The whole iris turned from a bright blue to a deep blue/black. Then she started slamming her head onto the table. I didn't know what to do. She pulls her head up, looks at me, and says, "There are angels and demons around all of us. They watch us. They watch us." Then she grabbed my wrist, started shaking my arm and said in a weird voice, "Your angel is Laura. Your demon has no name. He bites me. Make him stop." Then she started slamming her head against the table. By that time the nurses and aides came in and took her to the, literal, padded room to chill out. My mother's name is Laura. She had died a few months beforehand. I decided I was scared shitless of that girl. The day I was released from the psych ward, she slipped me a note and all it said was, "Laura." It was terrible. I used to work with this one guy many years ago. This was my first real job. Guy was intimidating as all hell. As in special forces intimidating. I can kill you 5 ways with my pinky scary. Didn't help that the guy always carried a pistol. Legally, and not concealed at all. Now he was not actually mean or bad or anything but nice, but he just had this aura of terrifyingness about him. If he came up to you and went, "Hey Sterling Phoenix, why did the chicken cross the road?" You'd go, "I'll get right on that, sir." Old cafe customer. We nicknamed him Lurch. He was about mid-30s, long scraggly heavy metal hair, ripped jeans, leather jacket, dirty t-shirt, tall skinny. No weird tattoos or 666 on his forehead. He is still the scariest person I have ever encountered. To put it in perspective, I have been attacked and spit on by a crazy-ass homeless dude with boils on his face, and he didn't scare me as much as this guy did. He would come in every day for a cup of drip coffee and would just sit and stare at our 16-year-old female barista. All questions were answered with a dirty look, a grunt, and or some mumbled phrase like "someone should teach you a lesson." That last one was said to me after I confronted him about his obsession with my co-worker. It doesn't sound like much on the surface, just some loser dressing like he's going to a Poison concert circa 1988, but this man had the worst energy I've ever encountered. I've been in customer service for years, lived in some less than nice neighborhoods. I have met gang members and straight-up killers who I've actually liked and trusted. This guy sticks out because he would just raise the hair on the back of my neck when he walked in the door. The deadest black eyes I have ever seen. When you feel safer around an admitted murderer than someone, that's some shit. Our manager wouldn't let us ban him, so we took precautions. One of us would always make sure to see our youngest employee to her car. Many a night we would come out and he'd be in his Dodge Dart with 12 different colors of paint just hanging in the parking lot, waiting. We pooled our money and got a taser for the shop. We talked about getting a gun from someone's cousin. Finally, one of my other coworkers told her BF, and he and some of his less than savory cousins caught this guy outside and talked to him. We never saw him again, and for that I am thankful. Joshua met him in grade 5. He had crazy eyes and a lisp. A friend of mine got in his bad side, so Josh grabbed the biggest stick I have ever seen and hit him on the back. Poor kid drew blood and was left with a pretty nasty scar. But the craziest thing he did was try to build a bomb out of an old typing machine. Silly, I know, but he believed he could do it. He told us he wanted to kill one of our teachers. A week later they expelled him from school because they found him under said teacher's car. This kid was 11 years old. When I was a resource social worker, I supported foster parents. I had a file of a couple who had adopted their daughter's infant. They didn't like social workers, but I was just there to offer support and make sure they were getting what they needed. As I sat with the grandma at the kitchen table, Grandpa pulled out a switchblade and proceeded to cut his sandwich with it. He then ate the chunks off sandwich off the blade, all while staring directly at me. It was rather unnerving, and I just had this really bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. I had some paperwork for them to sign. I think it was for getting them paid for mileage, if I recall, and he refused. He just leaned in real close to me and said, "I'm not signing shit. Does that bother you? Well, suck it up." Buttercup then went back to eating off his switchblade. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. A guy that used to work on my team, he was a younger guy, maybe in his early 20s. He used to walk around muttering to himself and occasionally break out some martial arts moves at random. I overheard a conversation between him and one of our other team members where he basically admitted to stalking some girl. Yeah, he was terrifying. If anyone was going to shoot up the workplace where I work, it would have been him. Thankfully they fired him about a year ago. I'm not going to lie, the first few weeks after they fired him I'd always be on high alert when going outside after work. The husband of a co-worker. There was something I can't quite explain, a really terrifying vibe. Turns out I wasn't the only one to have that reaction. Lots of other female co-workers had it too. And it further turns out that the alarm bells were spot on. He ended up being a sexual predator and a murderer. He died in prison a couple of years ago. I was working in a restaurant as a server in Toronto, Ontario. I served a murderer the night he transported the body of his victim. I know this because the police questioned me after his arrest. My name was on his credit card receipt. I always trusted my intuition in people, so it was alarming to think I could have been so close to someone so evil and not have even noticed. I used to work with a guy who was quite candid about how he used to be involved in drugs and whatnot until he went to prison. One day I looked him up, and found out he used to be an enforcer for a drug dealer, and was known to have removed teeth from people who owed his boss money. There are people that I have been physically afraid of and emotionally afraid of, but the most startlingly scary person I have ever met is currently 12 years old. He is a kid I used to teach at my martial arts school. He quit almost a year ago. He is small and anemic and he weighed 64 pounds at age 11. But I am almost positive he's a psychopath. He's very intelligent and extremely good at lying. It's especially disturbing because you can see him learning how to be a better manipulator because he's not quite gotten the idea yet that he should hide some of his manipulations. For example, this one time some of us were standing around before demo team practice. He was walking by an older teen, about 18 years old, who was practicing with nunchucks. As he walked by, he turned to the older kid and said, "You hit me." The older kid said, "No, I didn't, I would have felt it." He said, "Oh yeah," and it's hard to describe, but you could see in his eyes that he was filing that information carefully away so that he could refine his lying skills. He would lie about things that didn't even matter, seemingly just to practice. As a group, the instructors have come together and we've worked out some of his more sinister manipulations and lies. Things he's done have shown that he doesn't really consider other people as entities with feelings and that he has delusions of grandeur. It's doubly scary because the other kids his age, and older kids, and even adults who don't know him that well, think he's great. He was easily the most popular and beloved student by all the other kids in the school by a long shot. It's hard to know what to do about it. I guess since he's gone he's not my problem anymore. A guy I played Dungeons and Dragons with years ago. I'll call him Dave because I can't remember his real name. I hooked up with the group through a local game shop. Dave was DMing at his house. I went to 2 sessions total. He was just kind of intense and took the game very seriously. We'd take smoke breaks in the front yard and he would throw a big Bowie knife into the lawn, over and over. Sometimes he'd jokingly throw it closer and closer to someone's feet. I just bailed after the 2 sessions because something was not quite right about him. A few years later he was all over the newspapers. Some other guy had gone missing and they found Dave with the missing guy's car. When they opened the trunk they found the other guy, or at least pieces of him. I seem to remember the guy's head was in a toolbox. I'm from a small farming town, and in the 2nd grade a new kid moved in, Brady. Because we were seated in alphabetical order I had to sit next to him. I realized there was something not quite right with him. He was a pathological liar, and not just about small things, about everything. He and I both went to morning latchkey, and in the 3rd grade he just stopped coming one day and switched classes as well as getting an assigned seat on the school bus route we both shared. When I was a teenager I was talking to my dad and wondered aloud why Brady had gotten kicked out of latchkey that year, and I finally found out why. Turns out he had snuck up behind me and choked me out until I passed out and I had blocked out the whole incident. He also snuck a stapler and a pack of staples out of school one day, sat behind me on the bus, and tried to force staples into my head. Thankfully he was really small for his age and wasn't strong enough, and I'm a girl with very thick hair that was up in a ponytail, offering some protection. In high school he continued with the lying and moved on to drug dealing. I'm 25 now and have no idea what he's up to, but I think I would still go into a cold panic if I ever saw him again. My brother-in-law has a friend him and my buddy went to school with. I have dubbed him Serial Killer Josh. I don't know what it is, but this guy terrifies me. He's a troll in human form, getting immense pleasure from setting people up and just watching the mayhem that follows. He exhibits every behavior indicative of a psychopath. He's not allowed at my house or near my family. My bro-in-law and buddy laugh it off, but I've got a fairly good radar for bad people, and there is something absolutely wrong with that guy, and I refuse to be around when the screws come loose. My mate the Russian. He's not entirely Russian, but enough to be scary. He's also pretty stocky build, and bald. Here's the thing about the Russian. He's got an angry resting face but is pretty nice most of the time. Then one week, "Hey the Russian, what happened to your old laptop? Just noticed you got a new one." Friend was being a shit, so I smashed him in the head with it. Then dragged him out of my house. Also has 8 phones. I swear, he's got to be some sort of mini mob boss or something. Me. It was Oktoberfest in Okinawa, Japan, and the Sapporo Beer Festival was on. Lots of good German, Japanese food, good beer, good times. It was getting late, and I'd been drinking soda for the last 2 hours, so I started heading back for the car. It was sort of a long way, and the winding stone path went through several bushes, almost like a maze, except no real walls. It was dark, and I wasn't really paying attention to my surroundings other than to keep walking toward the parking lot, and that's when I noticed the Japanese lady in front of me is speed walking and looking over her shoulder at the big scary American guy. She cut onto a different path, which is a better path to the parking lot, and I took the same path. She looked over her shoulder, saw me and gave a shriek, and started running. I really had no clue. I seriously looked behind me to see what she was running from. When I figured it out, I felt so guilty, so I waited a moment, then continued on to the parking lot. I couldn't see her anymore, and figured that was a good thing. When I walked up to my car, I suddenly heard a gasp, and looked up to see she had parked right next to me. She was there, frozen, with her keys in her hands and looking at me with her mouth open. So I jogged away from the parking lot, out into a grassy area about 60 feet away, then turned and sat down on the grass, near a park light, so she could see me. She unfroze, got in the car, and got out of there fast. I think she might have even chirped her tires. I felt bad about that. In my rural neighborhood there were these two brothers. One was my older sister's age, the other a bit younger, maybe 4 years older than me. I'll refer to him John. John was a sociopath. All the kids younger than John were afraid of him. He was pale and had a piercing, menacing stare. One day as he was exiting the school bus, he smashed my head into the wall of the bus, knocking me momentarily unconscious. I was 10 years old. If I recall correctly, John got sent to juvenile detention for that, so no one saw him for a few years. When he returned to the public school system, he was still in high school and I was in junior high. He no longer rode my bus route, so thankfully I could easily avoid him. He was back at school for probably about half a semester when one morning a story quickly spread that he had assaulted another little kid on his bus. Within moments of the first bell, the city police were on the scene and most of us got to see John escorted to the office. As the story goes, John was searched for a weapon and an empty hypodermic needle was found in his boot, along with a little blood. He had stabbed an 8-year-old in the neck with a needle, just for kicks. He was arrested and went back to juvenile detention, this time until he was 18. I saw him just once more in my life. I was driving deliveries for my summer job and he had moved in with some relatives in the same town in which I worked. He was out skateboarding, still pale, with an unkempt burgeoning beard. When I played GTA 5, I imagined a grown-up John to pretty much be Trevor. My ex. She's got all the people around her fooled. She's the kind of person who will do anything, as long as she thinks she can get away with it. I was under the impression that she was nice and innocent, but oh boy was I wrong. She was manipulative to the point where I was catering to her every need, and I didn't even know it. From the outside, everybody saw that there was something off about our relationship, but they just don't know how deep it goes. As an example, this is a girl who will have no qualms killing off an entire race. Not that she hasn't been exposed to genocide, but just that she didn't care, and I quote, "They deserve to die." The scary thing is, none of her friends know this side of her. They see her as a bubbly, attractive girl who's always happy all the time. They don't know the fact that she's 2 years older than she says she is racist to the point where it puts the KKK to shame, emotionally manipulates everybody she can, and deceives everybody she meets. She's going to be a CEO someday. He came into the coffee shop I was working in one night. I don't know what he looked like. His face was like a black hole because all I could feel was his energy. Insane, dark energy. I don't remember his voice either. Everything about him screamed run at me. Luckily he ordered something easy, like a black coffee. I handed it and his change quickly because there was a voice in my ear that said get this guy out of here. Luckily he left right after. I have never come across anybody with energy like that. It's funny that you mention this. Not 2 days ago, my wife feared her brother would harm her. Her brother is not an evil person. He's been abused his entire life, and clearly has some mental issues. Most of the time he's a giant child who bounces from relative to relative asking for money, favors, and a place to stay. But every now and then, as if an evil light switch has been flipped, he gets dark and aggressive. He was kicked out of his mom's house for knocking her down. He was sent to jail for bashing his mother-in-law over the head with a glass jar, then reaching for a knife. He was no longer welcome in my home without me being there to supervise after he told my 4-year-old son he was like the Joker and would likely die after being gunned down by the police, then scaring my wife to the point where she took my son and ran out. These are not in chronological order BTW. 2 nights ago, my wife went to visit her mother and found him there. She said she immediately knew he was aggressive. His first comment to her was how dare she disrespect him by refusing to give him money. When she refused to discuss it with him, he stood up ready to fight. When my wife left the room, he accused her of going for a knife. He told her if their mother wasn't in the room, He'd beat her. I'm not mad at him. This kid has been beat by his dad, brother, on the street, etc. His mental disorders have reached a point where it's hard to hold a conversation with him. He's not an evil person, but I cannot allow him near my family. I'm not just scared of him, I'm scared of what I'll have to do to him. I was clerking for the Constitutional Appellate Court of Uganda when I came face to face with a murderer of their own 10-year-old child. The facts of the case chilled my blood, and I saw a lot of very disturbing cases during my time there. The convicted was a mentally ill mother of several small children, one of whom, a 10-year-old, ditched school one day. When his mother came home and found the child not in school, she tied him to a tree and began beating him. She then took banana leaves and stuffed his shirt and pants full of them. Banana leaves are highly flammable. Then she piled leaves around him. She lit her own child on fire and stood there watching him burn. The child's uncle approached the scene at this moment and ran toward the child, attempting to free him of the ropes and put the fire out. The mother began beating the uncle and pushing the child back against the tree and the pile of leaves as he continued to be engulfed in flames. Unfortunately, by the time the uncle freed the child and put out the fire, the kid was so badly burned, he died before medical treatment could be given. She appeared in court the day I saw her in her prison uniform, hair unkempt, eyes wide and bloodshot. This was several years after the murder. She stood during the hearing, which took little more than an hour, and looked around at the lawyers and judges as they recited the facts of her son's murder. I of course can't be sure of what was going on in her head during that time, but I believe that I saw a look of satisfaction on her face and a dark rage, as if had her hands been unbound, she would reach out and strike the nearest person. She seemed not to react at all when the court upheld her death sentence. I remember feeling very unclean and sick after the hearing was over. I was at a crazy party on a farm once, tons of people, tons of drinking, all out the middle of nowhere. At some point, the drunkest guy I've ever seen in my life starts following me around. He tells me I'm the guy who killed his dog, and that he intends to put me in the ground. He was so drunk he could barely stand, so I wasn't too worried. The thing that was scary about it was just how sure he was. My buddies and I get shit-faced all the time, but I've never seen anything like this. He absolutely intended to kill me. My ex. She had borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and OCD. The effect of the combination of these was truly remarkable, and, from a far-removed standpoint, really fascinating. From up close, it was awful. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.